The morning, everything changed. I was eating reheated soup at my kitchen table in a house that had been too quiet for going on 4 years. It was early, maybe 6:15. The kind of gray morning where the light doesn't really arrive so much as it just slowly stops being dark. I had a cup of coffee cooling next to me that I kept meaning to drink. Outside the window, the garden my wife, Eleanor, had planted along the back fence was coming in late that year. The tomatoes were still small, green and hard. I was 73 years old. I had just sold my company for $14 million. And I was eating soup alone out of a pot I hadn't bothered to transfer to a bowl. I wasn't unhappy. I want to make that clear. I just didn't know yet what I was supposed to feel. The number didn't feel like anything yet. It sat in my head the way big numbers sometimes do, too large to actually land. 3 days later, I got a phone call that made $14 million feel like the least important thing in the room. It came from a man I had trusted completely for over 20 years. What he asked me to do? I still think about it sometimes, on mornings like that one. Quiet, gray light, soup going cold. There's a folder on my desk right now that wasn't there 6 months ago. I'll get to that. My name is Raymond Collier. For 34 years, I ran Collier Tooling and Fabrication out of a small industrial park in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We made precision components, custom work, mostly for clients in the defense and commercial aviation sectors. The kind of parts that had to be right the first time, every time, because the alternative wasn't a customer complaint. The alternative was something you didn't let yourself think about too directly. I had started the company with a used CNC machine, a lease I couldn't really afford, and a single contract I had spent 11 months chasing. My wife Eleanor used to joke that she married a man and ended up married to a machine shop. She said it the way people say things they're actually proud of. She passed in the spring of 2020. Pancreatic cancer. 13 months from diagnosis to the end. Toward the end of those 13 months, I was with her every day, and the company kept running because I had spent 30 years building a team that didn't need me standing over them to do good work. That was the thing I was most grateful for that year. Not the revenue, not the contracts, the people. After Eleanor, I stayed busy the way men my age tend to stay busy when they don't have another option. Work was the language I still knew how to speak fluently. Everything else had developed a slight accent I couldn't quite place. The acquisition offer came in late fall of last year. A larger aerospace group out of Cincinnati had been watching us for a while. I knew that. The number they put on the table was fair. My financial advisor, a careful woman named Sheila, told me not to take the first offer. I didn't. The second offer was $14 million. Clean acquisition, full asset transfer, IP, client contracts, the whole thing. I handed the process to my attorney, a man named Leonard Marsh. Leonard was 67. He had a corner office downtown, a calm manner that never seemed performed, and the kind of institutional memory that only comes from decades of practicing in one place. He had handled Eleanor's estate. He had helped me through a supplier dispute that could have turned ugly. He had been at our kitchen table more than once, eating Eleanor's cooking and talking about nothing important, the way people do when they're comfortable with each other. I trusted Leonard Marsh the way you trust very few people past the age of 50, without much thought, which is a thing I have since reconsidered. He called me on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days before the final signing. I was in the garden when the phone rang, trying to figure out why the tomatoes were coming in slow. I answered without looking at who it was. Raymond. His voice was lower than usual. Careful. I need to ask you something. I need you to let me finish before you respond. I stopped what I was doing and stood up straight. Go ahead, I said. There was a pause. A short one, but I noticed it. Leonard Marsh did not pause before sentences. When this deal closes, he said, I need you to tell people it went badly, that the sale fell through, that you had to liquidate at a loss and walked away with almost nothing. I didn't say anything. I need you to tell that to certain people specifically, people who know me, people connected to my son. The garden was very quiet. A car went by on the street somewhere behind the fence. Leonard, I said finally, what are you talking about? He said he would explain. He said it was complicated. He said he just needed my word first. I told him I needed time to think. He said he didn't have much of that to give me. I went inside. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter next to Eleanor's old ceramic fruit bowl, the one she bought at a market in Savannah the year we took that trip down south. I looked at it for a while. Then I sat down. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay on my side of the bed. I still kept to my side. 3.5 years later, The way a person keeps to a lane on an empty road out of habit, and I stared at the ceiling and tried to work through it slowly. Leonard had a son named Derek. Derek Marsh was 31. I had met him maybe 6 or 7 times over the years, always at Leonard's holiday gatherings, always dressed a little sharper than the room required. He worked in finance. Private investment, I recalled. He had the kind of easy confidence that comes from growing up in a house where problems had a way of getting handled before they got too loud. I hadn't thought much about Derek one way or the other. He was Leonard's son. That was the full extent of my interest in him. Now I was lying in the dark thinking about him at midnight. The thing that kept turning over in my mind wasn't anger. It wasn't even confusion, exactly. It was the sound of Leonard's voice on that call. I had known that man for 22 years. I had heard him deliver bad news without flinching. I had watched him sit across from opposing counsel in a deposition and stay so still and composed that the other attorneys started making mistakes just trying to fill the silence. Leonard Marsh did not rattle. But on that call, something underneath his voice had shifted. Something structural. The way a floorboard sounds different when the wood underneath it has started to go soft. You don't always see it. You hear it. That sound bothered me more than the request itself. In the morning I called my granddaughter, Simone. She was 28, lived in Indianapolis, worked for a data analytics firm. She was sharp in the way that quiet people are sometimes sharp. Not loudly, not performatively, but in a way that you only noticed once she had already figured something out that you were still working on. I didn't give her the full picture. I told her I had a name I needed her to look into professionally, discreetly. I gave her Derek Marsh's name and told her he worked in private investment, Fort Wayne or possibly Indianapolis area, and that I was trying to understand his current professional situation. She asked me if everything was all right. I told her I wasn't sure yet. She called me back that evening. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm. Outside, the sky was doing that thing it does in Indiana in late autumn, turning a deep flat gray that makes the whole world look like it's been pressed under glass. "Grandpa," she said. Her voice had that particular quality it gets when she's being careful with something. "Where did you get this name?" "Why?" I said. She took a short breath. "Because Derek Marsh has been managing a private investment fund for the past 3 years. Mid-sized, targeted at high-net-worth investors, mostly regional. The pitch, from what I can find, was that the fund had preferential access to manufacturing and industrial exits in the Midwest. Exclusive deal flow. That was the phrase being used. I set my mug down. Exclusive deal flow, I repeated. That's the language showing up in investor forums. There are threads going back about 4 months from people saying they haven't received quarterly statements. One investor posted that his calls weren't being returned. She paused. "There's a formal complaint filed with the SEC, filed about 5 weeks ago." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard next door. A brief sound, then nothing. "Simone," I said, "this fund, the pitch about exclusive access to manufacturing exits in the Midwest." "Yes." "Was my company mentioned?" "Collier Tooling." A pause that was one beat too long. "Not by name in anything public," she said carefully. "But the description matches closely enough that if someone who knew your business read the materials, they would know." I thanked her. I told her she had done good work. I told her not to mention this conversation to anyone yet. I sat at that table for a long time after we hung up. The picture was not complicated once you had all the pieces in front of you. Derek Marsh had built a fund. To attract investors, he needed credibility. Credibility in private investment often comes down to one thing: deal flow, access, the ability to say, "We are connected to opportunities that other people cannot reach." His father was Leonard Marsh. Leonard Marsh had clients. One of those clients was me, and for 2 years I had been quietly preparing to sell a $14 million manufacturing company. Derek had used that. Not with my knowledge. Not with my permission. He had used his father's proximity to my business to tell investors that his fund had inside access to exactly the kind of exit I was about to complete. And now the exit was real, and it was large, and it was clean. Which meant that if the truth came out, $14 million, full acquisition, Gerald Collier walks away whole. The story Derek had been selling his investors would be exposed as something far more serious than an exaggeration. The SEC would have a thread. And threads, in federal investigations, have a way of unraveling the whole garment. Leonard hadn't called me to ask a small favor. Leonard had called me to ask me to help his son avoid a federal investigation. I folded my hands on the kitchen table and looked at Eleanor's fruit bowl. She had opinions about dishonesty. Clear ones. She didn't deliver them loudly. She didn't need to. She had a way of looking at you when something wasn't right that made arguing feel not just wrong, but genuinely tiring. I thought about that look for a while. Then I decided what I was going to do. Not that night. That night I just sat with it. There is a kind of thinking that happens before a decision that isn't really thinking at all. It's more like waiting for something you already know to finish arriving. I let it arrive. By the time I went to bed, I was clear. The next morning I woke up early. Not anxious, just early. The way I had been waking up early my whole adult life. The habit so deep in me now that my body didn't bother waiting for an alarm. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the garden for a few minutes while it brewed. The tomatoes were still green, still hard. Some things move on their own schedule regardless of what you want from them. I drank half the cup standing up. Then I sat down at the table with a legal pad and a pen and I started writing. Not a letter, not a plan exactly, just a sequence. The habit of a man who had run a precision manufacturing operation for 34 years. When something needs to be handled correctly, you write down the steps in order. You don't skip ahead. You don't circle back. You move through it the way you'd move through a production checklist, one line at a time, each one confirmed before you go to the next. Step 1 was simple. Close the deal as agreed. Nothing about my situation with Leonard changed the terms of the acquisition. The buyers at the Cincinnati Group had done nothing wrong. $14 million, full transfer, clean paperwork. That didn't move. Step 2, find new legal representation for the final signing. I didn't want Leonard Marsh anywhere near that closing table. Not because I was angry, because I needed someone in that room whose only job was protecting my interests, and Leonard Marsh had disqualified himself from that role the moment he made that phone call. Step 3 was the one I sat with the longest. What I did, or didn't do, about Leonard and his son. I wrote it down, and then I looked at it for a while. I called Simone again that morning. I asked her if she knew any attorneys in the Fort Wayne or Indianapolis area who handled complex transactional work. Someone she had encountered professionally. Someone she could vouch for directly. She gave me a name without hesitating. Patricia Osei, 44 years old, practiced out of Indianapolis, had handled 3 major industrial acquisitions in the past 2 years. Simone had worked adjacent to one of them on the data side and had watched her operate. She's the kind of attorney, Simone said, who reads everything twice and talks slowly on purpose. That was exactly what I needed. I called Patricia Osei's office that same morning. Her assistant told me she had availability later in the week. I said I needed to speak with her today if possible, that there was a time-sensitive transaction involved, and that I would come to Indianapolis if that was easier. Patricia called me back herself 40 minutes later. I explained the situation in plain terms. Active acquisition, $14 million, set to close in 3 days. Current legal representation had developed a conflict of interest that I was not able to discuss in detail over the phone. I needed someone to review the final documents and represent me at the closing. There was a brief pause on her end. "How large is the document package?" she asked. I told her. "Can you be in my office at 2 o'clock?" she said. I drove to Indianapolis that afternoon. Patricia Osei's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown. Clean, quiet. The kind of office where the furniture is good but not showy and the bookshelves are actually used. She met me at the door herself, which I noted. She was composed in the way that competent people are composed. Not performatively calm, just genuinely unbothered by the pace of things. We sat down. I handed her the acquisition file. She read, not skimmed. Read. I watched her turn pages with the steady attention of someone who charged for their time and intended to earn it. After about 40 minutes, she looked up. "The documents are clean," she said. "The terms are what you described. I don't see anything that benefits from a delay." She set the file down squarely on the table. "I can represent you at closing. I'll need 1 business day to review the final signature package when it arrives." I told her that was fine. She looked at me for a moment. "The conflict of interest with your previous counsel. You don't have to tell me the details. But I want to make sure there's nothing in this file that's been structured in a way that creates exposure for you." "There isn't," I said. "The issue is external to the transaction itself." She nodded once. That was enough for her. On the drive back to Fort Wayne, I kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The highway was flat and straight through that part of Indiana, the fields on either side brown and harvested and wide open. I have always found that stretch of road clarifying in a way I can't fully explain. Something about the flatness of it, the lack of obstruction. By the time I got home, it was early evening. I heated up soup. I sat at the table. I looked at the legal pad with the 3 steps on it. 2 of the 3 were in motion. The third one I still hadn't fully decided. I want to explain something about that, because I think it matters. I was not protecting Leonard Marsh. I want to be precise about that. What his son had done, using implied access to my company, my reputation, my pending transaction, to attract investors into a fund, that was not a minor thing. Investors had put real money in based on a story that included me without my knowledge. Some of them were probably sitting on losses right now with no explanation and no returned phone calls. That was real harm to real people. I didn't take it lightly. But there was a difference between not covering for Leonard and actively moving against him. Those were 2 separate decisions. They didn't have to be made at the same time. And the second one, the one where I decided what role, if any, I played in what happened next, deserved more than an overnight decision made while I was still inside the situation. I had spent 34 years building a company on the principle that the work had to be right before it left the building. Not almost right. Not right enough. Right. That standard didn't stop applying because the material had changed. So I sat with it. I finished the soup. I washed the pot. I put it back on the shelf where Eleanor had always kept it. Then I went to bed. The next morning I called Leonard. I didn't go to his office. Not yet. I wanted to hear his voice first. There is information in a person's voice that you can't get from a face-to-face meeting. Because when people can see you, they adjust. They perform. On the phone, especially an unexpected call, there is a half second before the adjustment kicks in where you hear the real thing. He picked up on the second ring. Raymond, not surprised. He had been waiting for me to call. That told me something. I need to meet with you, I said. Tomorrow morning. Your office. A pause. Short but present. Of course. What time works for you? 8 o'clock. I'll be there. Neither of us said anything else. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand for a moment. Outside, a light rain had started. Not heavy, just the kind of quiet rain that makes the air smell like soil and old leaves. I had always liked that smell. Eleanor used to open the kitchen window when it rained in the fall just to let it in. I got up and opened the window. Then I went to my desk. I want to explain what I did that afternoon because it matters to what came next. I was not building a case. I was not preparing for a confrontation in the way that word usually implies: sharp edges, raised voices, someone walking out. That was not what the next morning was going to be. What I was doing was something closer to what I had done every morning for 34 years before any significant conversation with a client or supplier or buyer. I was making sure I knew exactly what I knew. There is a difference between knowing something and being able to account for it clearly. The first is a feeling. The second is a practice. I had built a company on the second one, so I went through it methodically. I printed the SEC complaint reference number that Simone had found. I wrote down the timeline as I understood it. When Derek's fund appeared to have launched, the approximate window during which my acquisition was being privately discussed, the date Leonard had called me with his request, the date the complaint was filed. I did not need these things to be dramatic. I just needed them to be accurate. Dates and sequences are not arguments. They are simply the shape of what happened. When you lay them out in order, they tend to speak without any help from you. I also wrote down, on a separate sheet, the things I did not know. I did not know the full extent of what Derek had told investors about my company specifically. I did not know whether Leonard had been aware of his son's fund from the beginning or had found out later. I did not know whether Leonard had given Derek any client information directly or whether Derek had assembled the picture on his own from overheard conversations and proximity. Those gaps mattered, not because they changed what I was going to do at the meeting, but because walking into a conversation carrying assumptions you haven't examined is a way of making avoidable mistakes. I have found, over many years, that most serious errors in judgment come not from a lack of information, but from a failure to clearly separate what you know from what you have inferred. People collapse those two categories constantly. They don't mean to. It just happens. I kept them separate. By the time I finished, it was past 7 in the evening. The rain had stopped. The garden outside was dark and wet and very still. I made a simple dinner. I ate it at the table. I looked at the 2 sheets of paper, what I knew, what I didn't. And I felt the particular kind of steadiness that comes not from confidence, but from preparation. There is a difference between those two things as well. One more thing happened that evening. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. Indianapolis area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I picked up. Mr. Collier. A man's voice. Young, measured, but with something underneath it that wasn't quite steady. My name is Derek Marsh. I think you know who I am. I didn't say anything right away. I know you spoke with my father, he said. And I know you've been asking questions. I wanted to call you directly. I thought that was the right thing to do. All right, I said. I want you to know that I never used your name. Not explicitly. I would never have done that without. Derek, I said. Quietly, not unkindly. I'm going to stop you there. He stopped. I don't think this phone call is a good idea for either of us. I don't say that to be difficult. I say it because anything we discuss right now, without counsel present, is not going to help your situation and it is not going to change mine. A long silence. I'm not your enemy, I said, but I'm not the solution to your problem either. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Another silence. Shorter. Yes, he said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that sounded less like composure and more like someone finally understanding the size of what they were standing in. Get a good attorney, I said. Tomorrow morning. I hung up. I put the phone face down on the table next to Eleanor's fruit bowl. I sat there for a while in the quiet. I thought about what it must feel like to be 31 years old and to have made a decision that you could not walk back. I did not feel good about it. I did not feel satisfied. I just felt the weight of it. The way you feel the weight of something that is real and serious and belongs to someone else's life to carry. I turned the phone back over after a while. I looked at the call log. Then I did something I had been going back and forth on since the night Leonard first called me. I forwarded the record of Derek's call, the number, the time, the duration, to Patricia Osei with a single line. For your awareness. No action needed tonight. Not because I was escalating. Because an attorney representing me in a $14 million closing had a right to know when parties connected to a potential conflict of interest had made unsolicited contact with her client. That was not strategy. That was just procedure. Clean procedure, done for the right reason, in the right order. Step 1 was closed. Step 2 was in motion. Tomorrow morning would be step 3. I went to bed at 10 o'clock. I slept better than I had in 4 days. I arrived at Leonard's office at 5 minutes to 8. Not early enough to seem eager. Not late enough to seem like I was making a point about it. 5 minutes to 8 was simply the time I had said I would be there, adjusted for the parking situation downtown, which I had accounted for when I left the house. His assistant, a woman named Brenda who had worked the front desk for as long as I had been coming to that office, looked up when I walked in. She started to say something about letting Leonard know I had arrived. I thanked her and told her not to bother. I walked past the small waiting area with its 2 leather chairs and its side table with magazines no one ever read, down the short hallway, and knocked once on Leonard's door. "Come in," he said. He was at his desk. That was the first thing I noticed. Not standing, not coming to meet me at the door the way he usually did. Sitting behind his desk with both hands resting on the surface in front of him, fingers loosely folded, the way a man sits when he has decided in advance to stay very still. He looked older than the last time I had seen him in person. Not dramatically, just the particular kind of older that happens to people when they have been carrying something heavy for long enough that it starts to show in the way they hold their head. I came in. I closed the door behind me. I sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same chair I had sat in for 22 years of meetings. I did not take off my coat. We looked at each other for a moment. "I know," I said. 2 words. I let them sit there. Leonard closed his eyes briefly. "Open them." "How much?" he asked. "Enough," I said. "The fund, the investor complaints, the SEC filing, Derek's call last night." Something moved across his face at that last part. A brief tightening around the eyes. He hadn't known about the call. I watched him absorb it. "He called you," Leonard said. It wasn't quite a question. He did. I ended the conversation quickly and appropriately. I've documented it. Leonard looked down at his hands. He was quiet for a moment. In all the years I had known him, I had never seen Leonard Marsh look small. He was a large man in the ways that mattered, not physically, but in the space he occupied in a room. The way he spoke, the way he listened, the way problems seemed to reduce slightly just by being in his presence. He looked small now. "How long did you know?" I asked. "About the fund. About what Derek was telling people." He didn't answer right away. "Leonard." 6 weeks, he said. "I found out 6 weeks ago." His voice was low, even. The way a person speaks when they have rehearsed the sentence enough times that the emotion has been worn down to almost nothing. He came to me. He said the fund was in trouble. Redemption requests he couldn't meet. Investors asking questions he didn't have answers to. He told me what he had been saying to attract them. About my company. About your company. About others. But yours was the anchor. The one he described in the most detail. He paused. He never used your name explicitly in writing. He was careful about that. But the description was specific enough that anyone who knew your business would have understood exactly what he was referring to. And you didn't tell me. He didn't answer that one either, because there was no answer to it that held up. Instead, I said, you called me and asked me to help cover it. I asked you to. He stopped himself. Started again. I asked you to give him time. Time to manage it quietly. To work out a resolution with the investors before the investigation formalized. By lying about a $14 million transaction. By delaying the full picture becoming clear. I looked at him for a moment. Leonard, I said, that's the same thing. You know that. He didn't argue. That was the thing about Leonard Marsh, even now, even in this. He was too honest a man to argue a point he knew was indefensible. It was one of the things I had always respected about him. It made what he had done harder to understand, not easier. He's my son, he said. I know he is. I know that's not a sufficient explanation. It's an explanation, I said. It's just not a justification. He nodded slowly. Once. The nod of a man who had already had this argument with himself many times, alone, in the weeks before this conversation, and had never found a way to win it. I reached into my coat and took out a single folded sheet of paper. I set it on the desk in front of him. I didn't push it across. I just set it down where he could see it. It was the timeline I had written out the night before. The sequence of dates. Fund launch, acquisition discussions, complaint filing, his phone call to me. Laid out in plain lines with no commentary. He looked at it without touching it. I'm not here to hand you this as a threat, I said. I'm here because I wanted to have this conversation in person rather than through attorneys. I thought you deserved that. He looked up at me. I am going to close my deal, I said. On the timeline agreed. The full amount, accurately reported. I will not be describing a bankruptcy that didn't happen. I will not be providing cover of any kind for what Derek built or what he told people. Leonard said nothing. I am also not going to be the person who contacts the SEC on your behalf or his. That is not my role, and it is not my intention. What has already been filed was filed by someone else. What happens next in that process will happen without my involvement either way. I stood up. What you do now, whether you get ahead of this, whether you advise Derek to cooperate, whether you talk to your own counsel today, that is your decision. I have no standing to tell you what to do with it. I picked up the timeline sheet from his desk and folded it back into my coat pocket. I want to say one more thing, I said, and then I'm going to leave. He looked at me steadily. Whatever he was feeling, and I could see it was considerable, he was holding it with both hands. I don't think you're a bad man, Leonard. I think you're a good man who made a serious mistake because he loved his son more than he trusted his own judgment. I have known that particular mistake from the inside. It doesn't excuse what you asked me to do, but I understand the road that got you there. He looked down at the desk. I'm sorry, Raymond, he said, quietly, with no performance in it at all. I know you are, I said. I put on my coat the rest of the way. I picked up my keys from the chair beside me where I had set them when I sat down. Get good counsel today, I said. Not tomorrow. I walked to the door. I opened it. I didn't look back. The drive home took 22 minutes. The rain from the night before had cleared, and the morning was cool and very bright. The kind of Midwestern fall morning where the light has a particular clarity to it, sharp and clean and without sentiment. I kept both hands on the wheel. I didn't turn the radio on. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the conversation was already settling into the past tense in my mind, the way significant things do once they are finished. Not forgotten, just placed. Put in the correct location in the sequence of events where it belonged. I went inside. I made fresh coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. Outside, the tomatoes were still green, still hard, still on their own schedule. The closing happened 4 days later. Patricia Osei drove up from Indianapolis the morning of. She arrived at my house at 7:30 with a leather document bag and a cup of coffee she had picked up on the way. We sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes going through the final signature package page by page. She read. I read. We asked each other questions when something needed confirming. When we were both satisfied, We drove to the title company's office together in her car. The room where closings happen in that building is plain and functional. A long table, chairs on both sides, a window that looks out onto a parking structure. I had been in that room twice before for real estate transactions. It had the particular neutral quality of a space designed to belong to no one, so that everyone who uses it feels equally at home and equally temporary. The buyer's team was already there when we arrived. 3 people. Their lead counsel, a younger man in a good suit who nodded when we walked in and didn't say anything unnecessary. A representative from their operations division. A notary at the end of the table with a stack of documents already tabbed for signature. We sat down. Patricia set her bag on the table and opened it with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this many times and saw no reason to treat it as anything other than what it was, a process to be moved through correctly, one step at a time. It took just under 2 hours. $14 million. Full acquisition. Assets, intellectual property, client contracts, the name. Everything I had built in that industrial park in Fort Wayne for 34 years, transferred cleanly and completely to a group in Cincinnati who intended to grow it, which was the right outcome for the people who still work there. When the last page was signed and the notary had done what notaries do, Patricia closed her folder and looked at me briefly across the table. Not with celebration, just with the quiet acknowledgement of a professional who had done her job well and knew it. I thanked the buyer's team. I shook hands with their counsel. I picked up my copy of the closing package, which Patricia had organized into a clear binder with tabs, and I walked out into the parking structure's gray midday light. Patricia walked beside me. "Congratulations," she said simply. "Thank you," I said. We shook hands. She drove back to Indianapolis. I drove home to Fort Wayne. I did not hear anything directly from Leonard or Derek in the weeks that followed. What I did hear came through the kind of channels that information travels in a mid-sized Midwestern city where certain professional circles overlap, mutual contacts, a mention at the edge of a conversation, a brief reference from Simone, who had continued to follow the situation quietly from a distance. About 3 weeks after the closing, word reached me that Derek Marsh had retained a criminal defense attorney in Indianapolis. A well-regarded one, from what I understood. Someone who handled federal matters. A week after that, Simone told me the SEC investigation had been formally opened. Not a preliminary inquiry anymore. A full investigation. Leonard, I was told, had resigned from his practice. Quietly. A brief announcement to his clients. Referrals arranged. Files transferred. The kind of exit that speaks clearly to people who know how to read it without anything needing to be said explicitly. I also heard, from someone who had no reason to color it one way or the other, that Leonard was cooperating with the investigation. Voluntarily. That he had gone to the authorities before they came to him. I don't know the full shape of what happened in that meeting, or what he brought with him, or what it cost him to walk through that door. I didn't ask. It wasn't mine to know, but I noted it. I want to say something about how I felt during those weeks, because I think the honest version of it is different from what people might expect. I did not feel relieved exactly. Relief implies that a threat has passed, and I had never quite experienced it as a threat. Not to me personally, not after the closing was secured and Patricia was in place. What I felt was something closer to a settled heaviness. The particular weight of watching something consequential unfold in a person's life that you had some peripheral role in, even if your role was simply to refuse to participate in making it worse. There is nothing satisfying about that. I want to be clear about that. A man I had respected for over 2 decades was watching his professional life come apart because he had loved his son in the wrong direction. His son, a 31-year-old who had made decisions that could not be unmade, was now sitting in meetings with a criminal defense attorney learning the full dimensions of his situation. Those are not outcomes that feel like victories. Eleanor had a word she used for moments like this. Not a dramatic word, just a plain one. She called it the cost. Not of any one decision, but of the way things compound over time. Small compromises, small permissions, small moments where a person allows something they know isn't right because the alternative feels too hard. The cost, she used to say, always arrives. The only question is when and how much of it you've let accumulate. She was almost always right about things like that. About a month after the closing, Patricia called me. Not about anything urgent. She had a question about a document reference for her file. We handled it in about 4 minutes. Before she hung up, she mentioned, without elaborating, that she had received an inquiry from the SEC's Enforcement Division asking whether I had been represented by independent counsel at the time of the acquisition closing and whether that representation had been arranged at arm's length from my previous attorney. She had confirmed both facts. They had thanked her and moved on. That was the last time my name appeared anywhere in connection with the matter, as far as I know. I thanked Patricia. She told me to stay in touch. I told her I would. I set the phone down on the table. Outside, I noticed for the first time that the tomatoes had finally started to turn. Small red patches appearing at the shoulders of them. The green giving way the way it always eventually does when you stop watching for it and just let the season do its work. I put on my jacket and went out to check on them. They needed another week, maybe 10 days. But they were coming. Winter came early that year. By the first week of November, the garden was finished. I pulled the last of the tomatoes, the ones that had made it, the ones that hadn't, and I turned the soil the way Eleanor had shown me the first fall we lived in that house. She had learned it from her mother, who had kept a garden in central Ohio her whole life and treated the end-of-season preparation with the same seriousness other people reserve for things that feel more important. You put the ground to bed properly, her mother used to say, and it remembers. I don't know if that's scientifically accurate, but I do it every year. It took about an hour. My knees reminded me several times that I was 73. I ignored them. When I was done, I stood at the back fence for a while with my hands in my jacket pockets and looked at the turned earth. It looked the way it always looked at that point in the year, plain and brown and finished, ready for whatever came next, which for the moment was just cold and rest and time. I went inside. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink. I made tea. I sat down at the table. The folder that I mentioned at the beginning of this, the one that had appeared on my desk in recent months, was still there. It was not a dramatic folder, a plain manila one, the kind you buy in a pack of 25 at any office supply store. Inside it were documents related to a new matter. Not mine. Someone else's situation that had come to me through a mutual contact, a woman in her late 60s named Barbara, who had recently discovered that a financial advisor she had trusted for 15 years had been quietly misrepresenting the performance of her retirement accounts. Not a criminal matter, necessarily. Not yet. But the kind of situation where the gap between what a person had been told and what was actually true had grown wide enough that it could no longer be explained by error or oversight. Barbara was not sure what to do. She was not sure who to call. She had reached out to our mutual contact because she needed someone who had navigated something similar and come out the other side with their footing intact. I had agreed to meet with her the following week, not to be her attorney, not to manage her situation, just to sit across a table from her the way someone had never quite sat across from me when I needed it, and tell her plainly what I knew, what I had learned, and what the first careful steps forward tended to look like. Sometimes that is the most useful thing one person can do for another. Just be the one who has already been through it. I have thought a lot, in the months since the closing, about what the experience actually taught me. Not about Leonard, specifically, not about Derek, but about the broader thing. The way trust works when it has been in place for a long time, and the particular difficulty of recognizing when it has shifted without announcing itself. I had trusted Leonard Marsh completely, and that trust was not wrong. Exactly. Not for the first 21 years of it. He had earned it. He had been what I believed him to be for a very long time. What changed was not my perception of him. What changed was him. Slowly, under pressure, in the direction of his son. The lesson I took from it was not to trust less. I don't think that is the right lesson. A life organized around diminished trust is a smaller life than the one you started with, and I have no interest in that. The lesson I took was to stay awake, to keep the part of your mind that notices things, small inconsistencies, tonal shifts, the half-second pause that shouldn't be there, to keep that part engaged even with the people you trust most. Not suspiciously, not defensively, just awake. Eleanor used to do that naturally. She noticed everything about the people she cared about, not to catch them in something, just because paying close attention was how she expressed that a person mattered to her. I am trying to get better at it. Most mornings now I am up before 6. I make coffee. I eat something simple. I sit at the kitchen table with the window cracked slightly even in the cold because I have gotten used to the sound of the morning coming in and I find I miss it when it isn't there. The house is still quiet. That hasn't changed. Probably won't. But quiet is not the same thing as empty, and I think it took me longer than it should have to understand the difference between those two. I keep Eleanor's fruit bowl on the counter where it has always been. The ceramic one from the market in Savannah. There is almost always something in it. Apples, usually, sometimes oranges, because an empty bowl bothers me in a way I have stopped trying to explain. The company I built for 34 years is still operating. The people who work there are still working. The precision components are still being made to the standard I set a long time ago in a two-bay garage with a used machine and a lease I could barely afford. That part didn't change. Some things don't, if you build them right. $14 million is sitting in accounts managed by people who know what they are doing. I review the statements. I ask questions. I trust, but I stay awake. That is enough. That is actually quite a lot. If you have stayed with me this far, I want to say thank you. Not in a formal way, just genuinely. These are not easy things to talk about. A man I trusted asked me to do something I could not do, and the consequences of that ran further than either of us could see from where we were standing at the time. I don't know how Leonard is doing now. I don't know what Derek's situation looks like month to month. I hope, in the way you hope for people you have separated yourself from, that they are finding their way towards something steadier. But that is their story to live. This one was mine. If any part of it was useful to you, if something in here reminded you to stay awake, to keep your paperwork straight, to trust the people who have earned it and stay watchful even with them, then the telling of it was worth the time. Next week, I am meeting with Barbara. I'll let you know how that goes. If this story stayed with you, a like and a subscription mean more than you might think. They help this channel reach the people who need to hear these kinds of stories most. And I am genuinely curious. Where in the world are you watching this right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I read them. 2 more stories are waiting for you right now, just after this one ends. Both worth your time. Stay steady. Stay awake.